Red Bull just lost power, in the middle of a race they couldn't afford to lose, and now the FIA is stepping in. Not to observe. To investigate. Because what failed on Verstappen's car in China wasn't supposed to fail. Not like that. Not this early in the season. And definitely not on a system that's been designed for years under the new regulations. Here's the part that should worry every Red Bull fan. This wasn't a slow issue. This wasn't tire degradation. This wasn't strategy. This was a complete power shutdown, while fighting for position. And when that happens, it usually means one thing. Something is being pushed too far. But that's not even the biggest problem. Because while Verstappen was retiring, Mercedes was dominating. Flawless. Untouchable. A 1-2 finish that made the gap look bigger than anyone expected. And suddenly, the team that ruled Formula 1 looks vulnerable. Now add this. The FIA has started looking closely at power unit behavior across the grid. Energy deployment, electrical systems, load limits, and Red Bull is now part of that conversation. This is where things change. Because if there's even a small irregularity, even a minor technical breach, the consequences won't just affect one race. They could affect the entire season. And maybe something even bigger. Because Verstappen himself already warned everyone. He said these cars are unpredictable. He said they feel wrong. He said every lap feels like survival. At the time, people ignored it. Now, it sounds very different. So the real question is not why Red Bull failed in China. The real question is, what did they discover that forced the FIA to start looking closer? And why does it feel like this is only the beginning? What makes this situation even more alarming is how normal it looked at the beginning. There was no immediate chaos. No obvious disaster. Just a Red Bull that didn't feel right. From the first stint, Verstappen was already fighting something invisible. Not another driver. Not strategy. The car itself. And this is where the story starts to split into two layers. Because on the surface, it looked like a difficult race. Traffic. Tire management. Dirty air. All the usual problems. But underneath that, something deeper was happening. The kind of issue that doesn't show up on timing screens. The kind of issue only the driver can feel. Small corrections mid-corner. Tiny hesitations on throttle. Moments where the rear just doesn't respond the way it should. And with these new generation cars, those details matter more than ever. Because everything is connected. The combustion engine. The electrical deployment. The energy recovery. All working together in one single system. Which means if one part is slightly off, the entire car feels wrong. Not broken. Just unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing Verstappen cannot work with. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Despite all of that, he was still moving forward. Still recovering positions. Still extracting performance from a car that clearly wasn't comfortable. Which tells you something very important. The raw speed is still there. Hidden. Locked behind a system that isn't behaving consistently. And that creates a dangerous illusion. Because from the outside, it looks fixable. It looks like setup. It looks like balance. But what if it's not? What if the issue isn't mechanical grip, but how the power is being delivered? Because there were moments in that race where the car looked fast on the straight, and then suddenly, flat. No build-up. No progression. Just a drop. And those kinds of inconsistencies don't come from aerodynamics. They come from energy systems. From deployment maps. From how aggressively the power unit is being used. And now we're getting closer to the real concern. Because if Red Bull is pushing their system harder than others, trying to extract more performance from the new regulations, they are also increasing the risk, not just of failure, but of crossing invisible limits. Limits that the FIA watches very closely. And this is exactly why the situation in China didn't stay as just a DNF. Because internally, moments like that trigger questions. Data reviews. Comparisons between teams. Between laps. Between deployment patterns. And when something doesn't match expectations, that's when attention turns into investigation. Now add one more layer to this. The timing. This is only the second race of the season. Which means teams are still learning. Still pushing. Still experimenting with the limits of these new systems. And sometimes, that's when mistakes happen. Not intentional, but dangerous. Because in Formula 1, the difference between innovation and violation is incredibly small. And Red Bull has always lived right on that edge. That's how they win. That's how they dominate. But now, that same philosophy might be putting them in a position they cannot control. And the most revealing detail of all is how quickly everything escalated. From a difficult race, to a retirement, to technical questions, to FIA attention. That kind of chain reaction doesn't happen without a reason. Which means one thing. China was not the problem. China exposed the problem. And what comes next will define whether Red Bull can contain this, or whether this becomes the story of the entire season. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people are not paying attention to. Because the failure itself is only half of the problem. The other half is what Red Bull did immediately after. There was no detailed explanation. No clear breakdown. Just a controlled message. Power unit issue. Under investigation. We'll learn from it. And in Formula 1, when the message is that clean, it usually means the situation isn't. Because teams don't hide good news. They manage bad news. And right now, Red Bull is managing something. Now think about this. In previous seasons, Red Bull's biggest strength was not just speed. It was control. They understood their car better than anyone. They operated in a window that looked invisible to the rest of the grid. And more importantly, they rarely made mistakes. Especially not technical ones. But this is a different era. New regulations. New systems. New dependencies. And suddenly, that control is not as absolute as it used to be. And this is where another critical detail appears. The power unit. Not just as a component, but as the core of everything. Because in this generation, you don't just drive the car. You manage energy. Every straight. Every braking zone. Every deployment phase. It's a constant balance between performance and survival. Push too little, you lose time. Push too much, you risk everything. And what happened to Verstappen? Looks exactly like that line being crossed. Not gradually, but instantly. Which suggests something even more uncomfortable. A threshold. A limit that was reached and then exceeded. And once that happens, there is no recovery. Now connect this with what engineers fear the most. Not visible failures. Not predictable degradation. But sudden, total loss of power under load. Because that points to something deeper. Something systemic. And that is exactly the type of scenario the FIA monitors closely. Not because of one team, but because of what it could represent. A loophole. An aggressive interpretation. Or a design philosophy that pushes the regulations to their absolute edge. And Red Bull has built its legacy on living at that edge. But here's the twist. Living on the edge works until the edge moves. And in 2026, the edge has definitely moved. Now let's go one layer deeper. Because there's a pattern starting to form. Small signs. Easy to ignore individually. But dangerous when you connect them. Unstable rear behavior. Narrow setup window. Driver discomfort. Inconsistent power delivery. And now, a complete failure. Each one on its own, manageable. Together, they tell a different story. A car that is not fully understood yet. A system that is not fully under control. And a team that might be reacting, instead of leading. Which is something we haven't said about Red Bull in years. But this is where everything tightens. Because while Red Bull is dealing with uncertainty, Mercedes is operating with clarity. Everything looks deliberate, measured, repeatable. And that difference is what wins championships. Not just speed, not just talent, but control over complexity. And right now, that control seems to be slipping away from Red Bull. But don't miss this part. Because this might be the most important piece so far. If the FIA confirms that Red Bull is operating too close to critical limits, even without a clear rule break, they can still intervene. Through technical directives. Through clarifications. Through subtle changes that force teams to adjust. And those adjustments? Always cost performance. Always. So even if Red Bull did nothing illegal, they could still be forced to slow down. To protect reliability. To stay within safer margins. And that changes everything. Because Formula 1 is not about being fast in theory. It's about being fast, within constraints. And if those constraints tighten, the entire competitive order can shift. Now imagine this scenario. Red Bull becomes more conservative. Mercedes continues to extract maximum efficiency. Ferrari keeps closing the gap. And suddenly, the advantage disappears. Not overnight, but race by race. Point by point. Until one day, it's gone. And here's the final layer you need to see. This is not just technical. This is psychological. Because drivers feel these things before anyone else. They sense instability. They detect inconsistency. And once doubt enters, it doesn't leave easily. And Verstappen is already showing signs of that doubt. Not directly. Not openly. But in the way he speaks. In the way he reacts. In the way he describes the car. Because when a driver starts saying that every lap feels like survival, that's not just feedback. That's a warning. So now everything leads to one question. Not about China. Not about one failure. But about the direction of the entire project. Is Red Bull still in control? Or are they chasing something they no longer fully understand? Because if it's the second option, then what happened in China was not the exception. It was the first clear signal. And what comes next might be impossible to stop. And yet, even with all of this, there is one piece of the story that nobody inside the paddock is willing to say out loud. Because it changes everything. Not just for Red Bull, but for the entire future of the season. And it starts with a simple question. What if this is not a reliability issue at all? What if this is the cost of chasing an advantage that no longer exists? Because under the new regulations, the game has changed completely. This is no longer about building the fastest car in clean air. It is about building the most efficient system under constant restriction. Energy limits, deployment windows, thermal constraints, software control. Everything capped. Everything monitored. Everything regulated. Which means the old Red Bull philosophy, push harder, extract more, live on the limit, might not just be risky anymore. It might be outdated. And that is a dangerous realization. Because if Red Bull built the RB22 around that same aggressive DNA, then they are not just fighting other teams. They are fighting the rules themselves. And rules always win. Now here's where things become even more uncomfortable. Because when a team realizes that its core concept might be wrong, they face two options: double down, or change direction. But in Formula One, changing direction is not simple. It means redesign. It means compromise. It means accepting that what you believed at the start of the season was not enough. And for a team like Red Bull, that is not just a technical shift. It is a cultural shock. Because dominance creates confidence. And confidence creates resistance to change. But the clock doesn't stop. The season continues. Points are being scored. Gaps are being created. And while Red Bull is asking questions, others are collecting answers. Now think about what that means for Verstappen. Because this is where the pressure becomes personal. He is not just driving a difficult car. He is driving a car that might not evolve in the direction he needs. And for a driver at his level, that is unacceptable. Because elite drivers don't just want speed. They want predictability, trust, a connection with the machine. And right now, that connection is breaking. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Enough to create hesitation. And hesitation, at this level, is the difference between winning and disappearing. But here's the part that should really concern Red Bull. Because while they are trying to solve these internal questions, the outside pressure is building faster than ever. Media narratives, fan reactions, paddock rumors, all pointing in the same direction. Something is wrong. And once that narrative takes hold, every small issue becomes proof. Every mistake becomes confirmation. Every radio message becomes a signal. And suddenly, you are not just fixing a car. You are defending a reputation. And that is much harder. Because now, the FIA investigation is no longer just technical. It is symbolic. It represents doubt, scrutiny, attention. And in Formula One, attention changes behavior. Teams become more cautious. Engineers take fewer risks. Strategies become conservative. And without even realizing it, performance starts to drop. Not because the car is slower, but because the team is no longer operating freely. Now add one final layer. Timing. This is happening at the very beginning of the season. Which means one thing. There is still time to recover. But there is also time for everything to get worse. Because if the next race shows the same symptoms, if the same instability appears, if another failure happens, then this stops being a question and becomes a pattern. And once something becomes a pattern in Formula One, it defines your season. So now we arrive at the moment where everything connects. The philosophy, the failure, the FIA attention, the driver frustration, the competitive pressure, all pointing to the same possibility. That Red Bull is no longer ahead of the curve, and might actually be behind it. Not in raw speed. Not yet. But in understanding. And in this era, understanding is everything. Because the teams that win are not the ones who push the hardest. They are the ones who adapt the fastest. So the real story is no longer about what failed in China. It is about whether Red Bull can reinvent itself before the rest of the grid pulls too far away. Because if they can't, then this is not just the beginning of a problem. It is the beginning of a shift. A shift that could redefine the balance of power in Formula One. And the next race might already give us the answer.